everybody, it's Mark here again with ExoticCar PlayPlace. Today I want to welcome all of you guys, the guys that have been following me steady for the last little while here. Obviously, you know that I'm a real big fan of the BMW E60 M5. I'm also a big fan of the Lamborghini Gallardo and supercars alike. But I happen to have a couple of those, and I love the V10 monsters, the Lambo and of course the BMW. And today we're going to talk about the BMW E60 M5. So this message not only goes out to those guys that have been following my videos, this also goes out to those folks that if you're new to my channel, you make sure that you share, like, and for sure subscribe to the channel. Don't forget those notifications because that's going to link you up and let you know when I have a new video. Now that being said, we're into a series of videos on the E60 M5. And obviously, I've had videos in the past where I've talked about some of the key things that you need to know about the M5. Some of them are problems, some of them are just nice to knows, but they're not all the problem areas of these cars. And in videos to come up, I'm creating a series here. What you're going to find in the next bunch of videos is I'm going to create a bunch of videos on the M5, many of which are the specific problem areas. I'm going to summarize each one of those key problem areas that are unique to the M5 or the E60 M5 for sure anyway, that are unique to that car, and I'm going to talk about each one of those items, how they impact the car, potential costs. In many cases I'm going to talk about how to fix these problems, or I'm going to display or demonstrate or show you resources on how to get a solution to these issues. So we're going to talk about each one of those. Today we're going to talk about a little bit of a different one, but it has to do with the M5 nonetheless. And it has to do with the transmission. But very specifically, we're going to talk about the 6-speed manual transmission that was available in the E60 M5. Basically, in North America only, there was a demand for this from many customers to create that offering from BMW to provide a manual, a stick shift, if you will, transmission that would be available for the E60 M5. Now, of course, most of you guys know the SMG 7-speed single clutch transmission was the typical tranny that was available for this car, and it is very well suited to that machine. That being said, a lot of people had to have and want to have that 6-speed manual transmission. And so we're going to talk about a few of the things, primarily the top 5 things that really are not great about the manual transmission in the E60 M5. Now, most of you will know already, I love driving manual transmissions, but I do believe there's a place for them. And I think not every car is well suited to a manual transmission. Of course, the E60 M5 might very well be one of those cars. And so that's what this video is to really talk about. It's 5 of the top issues with the manual transmission, specifically to the E60 M5. And so let me just summarize by saying, firstly, before I get into the list, yes, the SMG is not short on its faults. So we'll be talking about that in a video coming up. That will be in the next of the series. But for now, irregardless of what transmission you choose, we can all agree that in the midst of the modern German hot rod era, the M5 is a thunder-wielding behemoth, which is truly one of the last titans. But today is the video we're going to talk about the manual transmission and the top 5 issues. So let's start with number 1. First issue reported by many owners of the manual 6-speed transmission in the E60 happens to be a crunchy first-second gear synchro shift. Obviously, people that typically buy these typically already know how to drive a manual transmission, so you'd have to assume that in most cases it hasn't anything to do with operator error. By the sounds of it, there's many cases that have reported a really rough and basically a crunchy first to second gear shift, and even more exaggerated when the car is cold. Sometimes it kind of dissipates a little bit when the car gets warmed up, but it's a lot worse in a first to second gear shift. Now, some people have experimented with different products for the transmission in terms of the chemicals or the oils or different additives that you can use, and some have had some success with that it's improved that crunchiness, and some haven't had that success. But basically products such as RP Synchromax is one good example that I've heard a lot of positive information on. Some people seem to like that product, although some report that it's great when it's first applied and then it slowly deteriorates. It gets worse and as well. Others report a product called Pentosin MTF2. That's another product that people seem to really find that works for this type of transmission, and it really knocks down that roughness of the transmission. And yet others talk about their transmission works flawlessly. So it's kind of all over the map. Some of them might be clutch related, some of them might be gearbox related, but at the end of the day, there's been many different attempts to try different things to make that better. Now, for those that don't or aren't aware, we're talking a ZF or Getrack transmission. So the next thing, number 2 item that really makes the 6-speed transmission undesirable happens to be around the overall heating of the transmission. There's been many reports as well where people take their M5 out to the racetrack, and after some laps and put some heat into the tires, unfortunately that heat is also in the transmission, and that results in a transmission fail. And what happens is there's a sensor in the transmission that feeds back to the computer and shuts down the computer and limits the RPM to 5,500 RPM, and typically shuts you down and reduces your speed and your output for at least a significant, probably 15 minutes to half an hour once you actually allow it to cool down. So this sensor kind of gets in your way of some of the fun. Now, I've heard of some people trying different things, undoing that sensor wiring, buying a spare sensor, tie wrapping it to the outside of the transmission, and just utilizing the ambient air. So you're fooling the computer. And they say they haven't reported any obvious deterioration in the function of the transmission that has worked in some applications. Nonetheless, it's a frustrating thing to have. So the third thing that makes the E60 M5 6-speed manual transmission kind of lousy in some regards happens to do with high performance driving, which unfortunately is counterproductive to the concept of owning the car in the first place. And a lot of reports that I've seen and research that I've done reports that when a guy's tried to do an aggressive burnout or try to do a brisk takeoff, what ends up happening is the computer basically effectively gets some sort of feedback and shuts down and doesn't allow you to over rev and constantly drive the wheels aggressively and allow you to get a massive amount of wheel spin, which is what a lot of guys like to do. They like to play, especially on a track, right? You want to rev it up, you want to break loose, spin those tires, maybe do some donuts. Well, there's been a lot of reports where that won't even work. The SMG transmission will. There's easy ways to instigate wheel spin on an SMG transmission. I know I've done it myself. But on the 6-speed, the computer sort of shuts you down. It senses this going on, and it actually shuts. A lot of people have reported shutting the computer down where they can't even break loose. They're able to maybe in some cases do a quick donut, but if they're trying to do a straight line acceleration and a little bit of smoke, it doesn't allow it to happen. Even with the DSC turned off, which is apparently the way to do this, it still shuts them down. There's been too many reports of this not being able to break loose and having these limited type of wheel spin opportunities in the manual transmission. You would think it would be the total opposite, but in reality, the SMG transmission is actually a little bit more functional that way, if that's kind of your game, if you like the smoke show part of this. The limited wheel spin thing apparently can be fixed by a TSB done at the dealer. Apparently there's a reprogram that can be performed at the dealer, so all you have to do is check with your local BMW dealership and they should be able to alter that for you. Hopefully make that change and give your BMW its newfound lease on that fun life. So the fourth thing that's not so great, and it has to do with the dual mass flywheel, and it has to do with clutch judder. And you probably know what that's all about. If you've ever driven a manual transmission, maybe you've had a clutch that's been kind of off kilter, something's not quite right. Engaging the transmission, or the clutch, engaging that, sometimes you'll get that kind of a buck, and it kicks and it feels kind of rough. Well, that's clutch judder. And sometimes there's been also many reports of people experiencing a lot of clutch judder in this cars. And it has to do around dual mass flywheel. And so the fifth thing that makes the 6-speed manual transmission less desirable than the SMG is the simple fact that the SMG was actually optimized for the V10 engine and its power band, while the 6-speed manual really wasn't. It wasn't designed, the ratios weren't really in sync with the power band of the engine. The ratios aren't quite the same as the 7-speed SMG. And so what that really means is things are not optimized like they are in the SMG transmission. So what you effectively have is a car that accelerates. It's hard to accelerate out of the hole because you've got clutch judder issues because of the dual mass. It's not optimized for on the fly passing because the gearing's a little bit longer because obviously you've got spread out gearing because you've got less gears. And so what that means is gear to gear acceleration slightly hampered versus the SMG, which shifts very quickly, so it doesn't matter about the shift time, but the gearing's reduced. It allows the car to accelerate marginally quicker. But also, and this is a big also and the caveat, of course, I wouldn't recommend this anywhere but on the racetrack, but at the end of the day, the final gear ratio is longer on the 7-speed gear than it is on the 6-speed gear. Now the overall final ratio is the same between the two, but the 7-speed has an actual final 7th gear is longer than the 6th gear on the manual transmission. So what does that really boil down to? That boils down to a reduced top speed. So it's got slightly poor acceleration and it's got a reduced top speed. So it's kind of a lose-lose in almost every regard. Now, that doesn't mean this is bad. That means don't go out. I'm not saying don't go out and buy the 6-speed. The 6-speed transmission has many, many great merits, and I would probably consider one too, just for the simple fact there's less moving parts. It's likely going to be slightly more reliable than you'd get out of the SMG. There's less stuff to go wrong, and it's going to be a lower cost in the long run. But if performance is your game, the SMG is the way to go. If the old school kind of style of stirring the gears and the feeling of being engaged in the car is your game, you go with the manual. You can't really go too wrong either way. I'm simply pointing out the 6-speed, everybody gives the SMG a pretty substantial bum rap. It gets a lot of negativity in the forums and in the press, but the reality is they both have upsides and they both have downsides. And I just thought today I would display the downsides on the 6-speed manual transmission. It's not quite perfection. BMW did not perfect that gearbox for that V10 engine. It's not as sorted as it possibly should be, and that's because it wasn't really intended that way in the first place. It was an afterthought. It was created for those customers that wanted that option, but it wasn't done widespread. You can't get it in Europe. You can't get it in a lot of other markets. So, guys, gals, I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, please do make sure you subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on your notifications, because I'm going to be creating a series of videos. The key problems that you're going to see in the E60 M5 and things that you want to be on the watch for. Costs, repairs, and how to deal with these issues. So again, thanks again everybody. It's Mark again with ExoticCar PlayPlace, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.